I'm very excited to share my love for the desert tradition with you this morning and offer a way of framing that tradition that hopefully responds to some of the needs of our time. Now, some may ask whether it's appropriate to talk about a psychology of the desert fathers and mothers. Why not just talk about their spirituality? And my answer is that their spirituality is so psychologically insightful that it's worth focusing just on that aspect of their spirituality for today. But in order to understand this psychology, we also need to know a little bit about where they borrowed some of this psychological insight from. Many of us know that Egypt is sort of the holy land of the ancient desert tradition, but we may not realize that Alexandria, the major metropolitan city nearest those holy deserts, was the center of the world of philosophy at the time. So before Athanasius of Alexandria wrote the life of St. Anthony, there was Philo of Alexandria, a great Jewish philosopher, just to name one well-known example of philosophy in the city of Alexandria. And it's important to know that ancient philosophy was not just about making intellectual distinctions. Rather, it was understood as a whole way of life with concrete practices which help the philosopher and those who come to the philosopher for advice both to confront suffering and find a way to happiness. In other words, we could understand ancient philosophy as a kind of therapy, and the various schools of philosophy as various approaches to therapy, just like we have various approaches to psychotherapy today, like psychoanalysis, cognitive behavioral therapy, and existentialist therapy, just to name a few examples. One example of this idea of ancient philosophy as therapy that's pretty easy to grasp is Stoicism. Now, today the word stoic is used to describe someone who doesn't seem to have any emotions, or maybe someone who just seems resigned in the face of suffering. And that's partly because of the Stoic idea of apatheia, which looks a lot like the word apathy, but which literally means without passion or without suffering. This does not mean without emotion, like our word apathy. It means something more like without emotional disturbance. So even today, we might talk about somebody who is suffering from a mental illness as being mentally or emotionally disturbed. It's a similar understanding there. So it might be fair to say that apatheia could mean without pathology. And in fact, we see the same root word here in both the word apatheia and in pathology. Of course, there are various degrees of pathology or emotional disturbance, and there are various ways of defining what is pathological. So to keep it simple, let's sum up the Stoic understanding of apatheia as freedom from anything that disturbs our natural resilience, especially when faced with troubles outside of our control. Now, I've chosen all these words pretty carefully, and there's a lot more we could say about this, but I just want to point out for now how this idea could be really helpful when it comes to thinking about how we might approach something like this coronavirus pandemic that we are in the midst of. Interestingly enough, the desert tradition picks this word up and sort of baptizes it to give it a Christian meaning. So from here on out, I'm mostly going to be drawing from the writings of the desert father Evagrius of Pontus and others who have been largely influenced by Evagrius' writings, because he, more than anybody else, has really developed what I'm calling the psychology of the desert tradition. I know this talk is titled The Psychology of the Desert Fathers and Mothers, and maybe I should have titled it The Psychology of Evagrius Ponticus. But if you want to go back later to read the sayings and the lives in the light of what I'm presenting today, you will see a lot of these ideas in action. And hopefully this will help you understand the sayings and lives in a new way. Anyways, Evagrius uses the word apatheia to describe the state of prayer. So what kind of therapy might Evagrius be offering, and what kind of pathology might he be addressing? The way Evagrius uses the word apatheia, we could say that he might define pathology as anything which gets in the way of prayer. Apatheia, then, in Christianity as opposed to in Stoicism, is probably best understood as freedom from anything which gets in the way of prayer, or perhaps even better, as freedom from that which gets in the way of love, given that we might even think of prayer as an expression of our loving relationship with God. Still, there were people in the ancient church, like St. Jerome in particular, who really didn't like this word apatheia, and he had good reasons, and maybe there's good reasons today too not to like this word apatheia. So when John Cassian, another desert father, who St. Benedict tells us in his rule that we ought to be reading this guy, when he picks up the Evagrian tradition, he drops the word apatheia. He doesn't use it anymore. But he uses another phrase in sort of the same way Evagrius uses the word apatheia. John Cassian uses purity of heart instead. And with this sort of transformation of the word apatheia, we could say that it's been fully baptized, as we are reminded of the commandment to love God above all else and to love our neighbors as ourselves, as well as being reminded of the promise in the Beatitudes that those who are pure of heart will see God. And now with that word, fully baptized, let's follow Christ, who after his baptism was driven into the wilderness. In the New Testament, the words wilderness or desert are both used to translate the Greek eremos, and it basically means an abandoned place or an uninhabited place, or perhaps even an uninhabitable place. In other words, if you go into the desert or into the wilderness, you are going to be lonely, and it's going to be challenging, and you're not going to have your normal comforts to turn to and distract yourselves from that challenge or from the loneliness of this place. Sounds a little bit like COVID, huh? I think it's probably fair to say that COVID is like a wilderness in this sense. But even with this negative description of the wilderness in the sense of absence of others and absence of comfort, the wilderness is both a necessary place, and once you learn some wilderness survival skills, it can be a place of great opportunity and even of joy. We can think about the psyche as a wilderness too. It can also be a lonely, challenging place. And all too often we'll turn to comfort or distraction so we don't have to go there. But it's necessary, and there are great opportunities in facing this inner wilderness. Carl Jung believed that we really need to be alone in order for our subconscious to make itself known. Now, it's there whether we know it or not, and it has a strong influence on a lot of our thought and behavior. There's stuff in there that gets in the way of our prayer. There's pathologies that prevent us from fully loving God and neighbor, that keep us from seeing God. So that's why solitude has been so important in the desert tradition. It's not a flight from others so we can avoid our duty to love them. Solitude is for the purpose of making the subconscious known, or making the thoughts of our heart known, so that we can cultivate purity of heart, so we can love truly and see God. But before we get to see God, we first have to look into our inner wilderness. And what might we expect to see there? Well, like Jesus, we can expect temptation. We can expect to be with wild beasts, which is sort of an ambiguous thing because deer and birds are nice enough, but mountain lions and bears can be real threats. So what kinds of wild beasts are we talking about? We might need someone to help us sort through that. Again, angels sound comforting, but wasn't Satan a fallen angel? There's all kinds of stuff in the wilderness of our psyche, some of it threatening. So it's no wonder we don't want to go there. But then again, threatening animals don't keep huge numbers of people from going on safari in Africa or from visiting Yellowstone National Park. In fact, while seeing a bear in the wild can be a terrifying experience, it can also be an awe-inspiring experience. They can totally kill you, but mostly they're just curious. And some bears have even been tamed. Before we try to navigate this inner wilderness, though, it's probably a good idea to get a sense of where we're going. So, what is the goal of the spiritual life? And are there any important landmarks on the way? What route should we take? Evagrius lists 3 stages of spiritual development. First is ascetic practice. Note that ascesis literally means exercise, and this might start to make some sense. You're probably going to want to be in shape if you're going to climb that mountain. For Evagrius, he's talking specifically of practices like fasting or chanting the Psalms, insofar as these practices heal us of that which gets in the way of our ability to love and pray, or insofar as these practices exercise and strengthen our ability to love and pray. John Cashin is very clear that all of our ascetic practices have to serve this purpose of purity of heart. So we're not talking about a sort of ascetic athleticism, as if like, see how few hours we can sleep or see how little food we can drink. That's not going to help us love. And all these practices are supposed to help us to love and to pray. This is the path to the apatheia, or purity of heart, that we discussed earlier. The next stage of the spiritual life is called contemplation of nature. Or in other words, we could say that once we are free from that which gets in the way of our ability to love and pray, we can begin to recognize the inherent dignity of everyone and everything on this earth as created by God. Other people aren't there just to meet our needs. The natural world isn't just a place to plunder so we can have another year of growth in the economy. And the wilderness isn't a place we should feel we need to conquer. No, all these things have an inherent dignity, and contemplation of nature means to recognize that dignity. In Laudato Si, Pope Francis writes about every created thing having a word or a message for us. And this is the stage where we can receive that message. Evagrius, before Pope Francis, talked about all created things having an inner word And it is in this stage that we hear that word. And finally, we reach the summit of mystical knowledge of God. Here, God is no longer a projection of our own fears of inadequacy or hopes of perfection. This is when we go beyond all created things and see the Creator face to face, which means to know God intimately, because God has revealed God's self to us and made us a true reflection of divinity. This, of course, is a lofty goal, and it is perhaps better suited for the resurrected life of the world to come. But the desert tradition has always yearned for this knowledge of God, even in this life. And some of the desert fathers and mothers went deep into the wilderness in search of this knowledge of God. The picture here is of Buffalo Hump, which is the highest peak in the Gospel Hump Wilderness, which you can see if you're here at St. Gertrude's across the prairie. And I believe this peak is actually visible from the monastery of St. Gertrude. I sort of like that the highest peak in the Gospel Wilderness is named Buffalo, because that also happens to be the nickname of Abba Paphnutius, who, according to John Cashin, got the nickname Buffalo because of the great fervor with which he moved into the most remote parts of the desert, seeking this mystical knowledge of God. So now we have a sort of map of the spiritual life. Now we need a map of the psyche. It was common in ancient Greek philosophy to speak of three parts of the psyche, and here we see Plato's breakdown of the psyche into the appetitive part, the emotional part, and the rational part. Even Paul had a three-part understanding of the human person as body, soul, and spirit. Evagrius also identified three parts of the psyche. If you read English translations of his work, you may see them listed as the concupiscible, the irascible, and the rational, but I have doubts about whether those words are actually English. So I suggest we call them the desiring part, the repulsing part, and the accounting parts of the soul. So we've got one part, the desiring part, that identifies physical wants and needs, and then attracts us to these things. There's a part that identifies threats and pushes those threats away from us. And then a part that sort of keeps an account of things. Or as we might say, where I grew up in the South, the part that reckons. Now I'm still thinking about whether it's really right to call the repulsing part of the soul the fearing part, like I've put on this slide. But if we go with it for now, then we've got one part that says, I want whatever that is, one part that says, I fear whatever that is, and one part that says, I reckon I'm a pretty good guy compared to so-and-so, bless their heart. And we can already start to see how some pathological thoughts begin to arise from these three parts of the psyche. The photo here is of the seven devils, also visible from St. Gertrude's if you get up on the hill. And I thought this would be an appropriate background for this section, since what we know of as the seven deadly sins actually started out as the 8 thoughts identified by Evagrius. And we're going to look at those thoughts in their form before they became the 7 deadly sins. So here's the list of these thoughts as I found them in the English translation of Evagrius' works. But one of these words is actually left untranslated. And I'm not sure that a couple of the others really communicate the intended meaning. So I'm going to go ahead and list them as gluttony, lust, greed, bitterness, anger, despondency, vanity, and pride. So according to Evagrius, these are the main pathologies of the psyche. That is, these are the main things that keep us from love and from prayer. And it's important to note that each of these thoughts is associated with a particular part of the psyche. So gluttony, as a pathology of the desiring part of the psyche, is an inordinate desire for food and drink. That's not to say we can't have a proper desire for food and drink, as both are necessary for our survival, as we'll find out in the wilderness pretty quickly. But we know that the desire for food and drink can get out of hand. Just as an example, we could think of comfort eating. We might eat to distract ourselves from difficult emotions, and then we don't adequately face those emotions. Or we could talk about alcoholism as an addiction to drink, and that would be an example of gluttony. Similarly, lust as a pathology of the desiring part of the psyche is an inordinate desire for sex. That's not to say that sex itself is bad, but the desire for sex can get out of hand and keep us from recognizing the inherent dignity of other human beings, considering them instead just to be there for our own pleasure, and this can become an addiction too. I think you can see how greed as an inordinate desire for wealth and possessions could also fit into this pattern as a pathology of the desiring part of the soul. One important thing to note here with this part is that it's important to properly distinguish between wants and needs, and then find healthy ways to meet our actual needs. Remember, this isn't ascetic athleticism. We do have real needs, and we should find healthy ways to meet them instead of just letting our desires get out of hand. As a pathology of the repulsing part of the soul, bitterness reminds us of all the times that we didn't get what we wanted. So maybe we pity ourselves for missing out. Maybe we regret leaving behind our old pleasure-seeking ways. Or maybe we feel cheated out of something that we thought was rightfully ours. In any case, once we identify someone we can blame for not getting what we wanted or for causing us some injury, then we're talking about anger. Now, it's one thing to say, I'm going to stay away from somebody who consistently causes me harm. That's a proper functioning of the repulsing part of the soul. And it's another thing to say, that person looked at me the wrong way, so I'm going to hurt them. That's a dysfunction of that part of the soul. So we need discernment here too. We need to ask, is this keeping me from love and prayer? And if the answer is yes, it's a sign we still need healing. At the end of this list, I listed despondency. This is the word that they've left untranslated in the English translations, partly because it's kind of hard to translate this word. So it's often less as acedia. And Evagrius tells us that this thought is particularly troublesome, and maybe especially for monastics. The Greek acedia literally means not caring, or to put it another way, not giving a insert expletive here. This word, rather than apatheia, might actually be more close to our modern meaning of the word apathy, not caring, So in monastic life, despondency can sound like screw the monastery, screw all these idiots here, screw trying to improve myself, or even screw life. I'm sure you all can imagine what these thoughts sound like in family life. I'll just add here that a lot of the troubled youth that I worked with in wilderness therapy were struggling mightily with despondency on top of many other things. And sort of as an aside, I suspect despondency might be behind some of the refusal to wear masks right now. Screw masks, I don't care. And then maybe one more comment about the repulsing part of the soul. If it is right to call it the fearing part, and I'm still trying to decide on this, then that can help us to understand the positive purpose of the repulsing part of the soul to keep us away from things that will harm us, like grizzly bears, for example. But it also sheds some light on the insight that anger is usually an expression of fear. Um, Something you might want to consider next time you're angry or you're with someone else who is angry is, you know, what is the fear behind this anger? All right, finally, there are two main thoughts which plague the rational or accounting part of the soul, and both of them have to do with how we reckon ourselves in relation to others. First, vanity is the motivation to seek praise from others. So I guess it's really less about how we reckon ourselves and more about how we want other people to reckon us. It could be something like showing off how much money we have so other people will think we're really something special. Or it could be doing nice things at church so that other people will think that we're good people. Remember, the question is this getting in the way of love or prayer? And if you're getting upset because nobody is lavishing you with praise for all the nice things you're doing at church, then doing nice things at church might have become a pathology that needs healed, or at least the motivation for doing these nice things needs healed. Finally, pride takes this a step further. It's not when you want other people to think you're something special, but when you're convinced you really are something special and screw anyone else who thinks otherwise because I'm a self-made man or woman. I think it's obvious how this attitude, even in its more subtle forms, would get in the way of love and prayer. So now we know what the main thoughts are, the main things keeping us from love and prayer, but how do they manifest themselves? How do we know that we're dealing with these? Of course, they're regularly operative behind the scenes without us even realizing it. And, we may get home after a long day and, wow, I got really angry there for no reason, but we sort of struggle to see it in the moment. This is part of why it's important to enter the wilderness, to enter that lonely place free of distractions where the thoughts can manifest themselves and we can face them. Maybe you were looking for a more comforting way of managing solitude and building resilience in the face of the COVID pandemic, but for better or for worse, this is what the desert tradition has to offer. An invitation to enter the wilderness so you can face some difficult emotions and troubling thoughts. Need to be alone in order for these thoughts to manifest themselves in a way that you can address them. So, what's keeping the loneliness of the COVID pandemic from turning into a solitude like that of the desert fathers and mothers? You know, where you can be free to pray without ceasing. Why aren't we praying without ceasing? What's getting in the way? The point of asking these questions isn't to beat ourselves up because we think we ought to be able to pray without ceasing. I think if we told the desert fathers and mothers that, really nothing's getting in the way of our prayer, we're just happy as larks, then they would probably tell us we're off track. A sister at another monastery once told me that she didn't think she was very good at centering prayer because she kept getting distracted and had to keep repeating her centering word. And I said, I suppose that means you're doing it right, since the point of centering prayer isn't to avoid distraction, but to constantly return to prayer. So again, this isn't about beating ourselves up, but it is worth asking, what's keeping us from prayer during this pandemic? Evagrius and Cashin both write a lot about the specific ways that each of these thoughts will manifest in solitude, preventing us from praying. But I'm going to turn now to a later writer in the Evagrian desert tradition, the Russian saint Neil Sorsky, because he will give us sort of a general schematic for how thoughts rise and fall that can help us understand how these thoughts are keeping us from prayer and how we can navigate them so we can return to prayer. Neil lists 5 escalations of a thought's power over us. Starting with the assault, the thought gradually claims us more and more until it turns into a full-out passion or pathology. So again, the same root word there from apatheia. And again, I'm not real sure that this English translation is the best way to go about things. So I've adapted the list to make a little more sense to me, but I'm drawing on the same ideas. So first is the urge. For example, I might be sort of lonely and want ice cream so I can ignore my feeling of loneliness. It's important to note at this point that Neil tells us the urge itself is not sinful. It just is. It just is. And we can't not have urges. But then we might begin to entertain that urge. So for example, what if I did get rich? Imagine all the great vacations I could take. Imagine all the beautiful women I would meet. And imagine all the fancy wine I could drink. This one's kind of ambiguous, Neil tells us. Whether it's sinful or not depends on how we handle it, whether we're able to redirect it to something good. Next, we might consent or agree to the thought. So yes, I will hurt that guy if I get a chance. At this point, the ambiguity is gone because even if I don't get the chance to hurt the guy, I've already psychologically agreed to hurt him. And you have heard that it was said to those of ancient times, you shall not murder. But I say to you that if you are angry with a brother or sister, you will be liable to judgment. The next escalation is interesting because while captivation or getting carried away by a thought is considered an escalation of the thought's power over us, some of that ambiguity of the entertainment returns here. On the one hand, we could, without willing it, get carried away with hopelessness after watching the news. But crying out to God for help, we are returned to ourselves right away, returned to prayer. That thought had a lot of power over us for a minute, and we couldn't return to ourselves without help. But nevertheless, our hearts remained pure. If, on the other hand, we get carried away by obsessive thoughts of hopelessness, then our ability to love and to pray has been seriously impeded. And finally, at the height of a thought's power over us, we can become so accustomed to it that it develops into a bad habit or even an addiction. This is when the urge for ice cream turns into an automatic response to eat a bowl of ice cream every time I have a feeling. We may call it self-care, and it could on occasion be self-care, but when it becomes this kind of bad habit, it turns out to be an impediment to truly recognizing one's own dignity, to truly loving oneself. So that's how a simple urge can escalate into a full-out pathology. Once then we are able to see how these thoughts are working on us, and we do need some alone time to see this. We're probably not going to catch ourselves in the midst of a lot of activity watching this very closely. But once we are watching this in solitude, are there ways to de-escalate these thoughts? Well, yes, there are. So Neil's guidance here tells us that we ought to consider how far the thought has been escalated in order to choose the right de-escalation strategy. For example, a simple urge can simply be ignored. I don't mean that we don't acknowledge the urge, but once it's been acknowledged, it'll usually just go away if we don't bring it up again. I might want ice cream, but I don't even have any in my freezer, so oh well, thought goes away. If we do catch ourselves entertaining an urge, we can redirect it to something more positive. So my fantasy about getting rich could be redirected to thinking about giving away all that wealth to the poor. But maybe we've gone even a step further and agreed to the urge. We've decided that we will hurt someone if we get the chance. Here, Neil says that we must repent by confessing to the Lord, taking accountability, and asking for God's help to make things right. Again, even if we don't actually hurt the person, if we've agreed psychologically to do so, then we need to take accountability for that. Now, if we're getting carried away with a thought, or we know that we can get carried away with it, we can turn away. So we might stop browsing the daily news if it's making us hopeless. And finally, for those bad habits or addictions, Neil counsels us to repent as before and to oppose these thoughts by taking active measures to prevent ourselves from falling into their grip. No, I don't mean that we just try to willpower our way through it as if, here's the thought and I'm going to oppose it and I'll crush it. That kind of willpower approach usually doesn't work. And it can actually spiral us even more into addiction. But what we can do is try to set ourselves up to look at this bad habit or addiction more objectively, so we can see what it's really about, and then work on de-escalating the thought until we can see that it's really just an urge that will pass on its way if we let it. A 12-step approach could be really helpful here. So we might need to go to an Ice Cream Eaters Anonymous meeting. I know I'm being tough on ice cream, but sometimes it really is just the silly little things like that keep us from prayer. Now, Neil's approach to watching our thoughts rise and fall is actually quite similar to some of the mindfulness practices that are becoming increasingly employed in psychotherapy today. The idea is pretty simple, even if it can be difficult to practice. The idea is just to pay attention to whatever you're doing, whether it's driving or cooking or mopping or reading or walking or praying. You don't really need to worry about avoiding distraction as long as you're paying attention, though you will probably need to set aside specific times for solitude, for prayer, and for other practices or exercises to help you work out your loving and praying muscles. But whatever it is you're doing, and while you're paying attention to whatever it is you're doing, just be curious about what thoughts arise. Kind of like that gentle grizzly bear checking out an abandoned campsite. Yeah. What's this about? The bear wonders. Is there anything here for me? Could it possibly be a trap? And then just move on. I've seen bears in the wilderness, and this is usually how they operate. They're just sort of curious about something new in the environment, and then they move on. Unless, of course, there is something there for them to eat. And then you don't want to get in between them and their food. We could also compare watching our thoughts like this to watching rafts float down a river. So a thought arises and it floats away. Maybe the rafters will share many pure thoughts with us. So they might point out that it's a beautiful day, that it's great to be alive, and that God ought to be praised for the goodness of creation. Cherish these thoughts. Maybe have a moment of gratitude or a nature appreciation moment as the raft floats away on its own, and then return your attention to whatever you're doing in the present. But maybe you will encounter some rafts with thoughts that distract you or inhibit your ability to love and to pray. They might point out that that guy over there is a real jerk, that life is hopeless, or that you've got ice cream in the freezer. Just acknowledge the raft with a wave and let it float away and return your attention to the present. If you get involved in an unhelpful conversation with someone on the raft, See if you can redirect the conversation, and then wave as the raft floats away and return your attention to the present. If you get convinced to jump onto the raft with the thought, then after you realize that you've got on the wrong raft, just take accountability, politely excuse yourself, and ask for God's help to return your attention to the present. Maybe a raft came in too fast and too close, and it knocked you over and you got swept away in the rapids. Ask for help to return to the shore, be more aware of runaway rafts, and return your attention to the present. And if you've developed a bad habit of chasing particular rafts down the river, ask yourself how you feel chasing those rafts down the river, because it probably is wearing you out. Ask yourself what need those rafts are meeting for you. What are you seeking on those rafts? Maybe come up with a plan to meet that need in a healthy way, and then return your attention to the present. Now, you might not think that mindfulness would be helpful when it comes to bad habits or addictions, but in fact, mindfulness therapy has been one of the most effective ways to quit smoking. I do want to say at this point, though, that mindfulness is not the same thing as prayer. Up to this point, we've been talking about the psychological aspect of desert or wilderness spirituality. And the mindfulness practice I just outlined is part of this psychological aspect. In a vigorous understanding of the stages of development, we haven't yet moved beyond the stage of ascetic practice. We're still purifying our hearts of all that which impedes love and prayer. Yet we may have begun to taste the contemplation of nature or appreciation of the inherent dignity of created things. And as our hearts continue to be purified, we approach the summit where God will reveal God's self to us. In other words, the spark that is the divine image within us can turn to flame when we take off the distracting thoughts suffocating our ability to love. All those things keeping us from prayer during this pandemic. And this flame can turn into a real fire when it's fed with understanding of the inherent dignity of all created things. But just as the spark is not yet a fire, and the wood we feed it is not the fire itself, so we have not yet reached the state of prayer until God has made God's self known to us, and we are able to maintain continual awareness of God. This is the prayer that the thoughts have been distracting us from, and this is what the created world has been pointing us to. But given that our hearts are so fickle and our minds are so frail, how are we ever to maintain this continual awareness of God? The same question plagued John Cassian until he finally received an answer from Abba Isaac. O God, come to my assistance. O Lord, make haste to help me. That's it. Abba Isaac chose this one line from the Psalms as the perfect prayer to be used in any circumstance in order to maintain a continual awareness of God. Think about it. Are there any circumstances in which this prayer would not be appropriate? With any thought that arises, pure or pathological, our attention is redirected to our dependence on God, and love and prayer is either made possible again or it is strengthened with God's help. Although it's a different formula, the Jesus prayer, also known as the prayer of the heart, functions in much the same way. Centering prayer is another practice that functions in a similar way. Just remember that the point is not to avoid distraction, which is impossible, but to constantly return to prayer. Thoughts are overturned not by defeating them outright, not by plowing them over with our willpower, but by turning them into an invitation to prayer, thus making them serve the very purpose they're working against. You know, if the thoughts are keeping us from prayer, but every time we recognize one of them, we turn to prayer, then they've had the opposite effect that they intended. And if we receive the grace to keep this up, we can become all flame as we enter into pure prayer. As Abba Isaac told Cashin, once the mind's attentiveness has been set ablaze, it is called forth in an unspeakable ecstasy of heart, with an insatiable gladness of spirit. And the mind, having transcended all feelings and visible matter, pours out pure prayer to God with unutterable groans and sighs. Now, there are a few characteristics of this pure prayer that, at least for our purposes today, highlight why it is that psychology is an integral aspect of desert or wilderness spirituality and not an accidental or optional part of it. That's why the psychological healing pursued in the stage of ascetic practice really matters when we get to the stage of mystical knowledge of God. Many scholars have noted that pure prayer, according to both Evagrius and Cashin, is characterized as unceasing, or to highlight even further something common to all the words here, ceaseless, imageless, wordless, and formless. So what might be the psychological significance of these characteristics of pure prayer? Here I'm going to make what might be a surprising claim. The psychology of the Desert Fathers is not intended to make us feel better, though it may do that. This therapy isn't even intended to make us feel closer to God, though it may do that too. It's also not intended to make us obsessively focused on our faults or our distracting thoughts. Rather, this therapy is intended to free us from idolatry so we can focus on God, to free us from our false images of God, to see God face to face. The law of Moses commanded that we not make any idols for ourselves, whether in the form of anything that is in heaven above, or that is on earth beneath, or that is in the water under the earth. Perhaps we usually think about idols as little statues, but the Desert Fathers and Mothers understood idolatry on a deeper level than this. Evagrius and Cashin were particularly sensitive to the way we set up little psychological idols and mistake them for God. Even the psychology I've outlined here today can be repurposed to serve the idol of endless self-improvement. For example, we may think of Jesus as an unnaturally easygoing guy who is always available to meet everyone else's needs. We then impose that burden on ourselves and get burned out pretty quickly. But that image of Jesus forgets about the Jesus who leaves town when there's still a long line of people waiting for him to heal them, or the Jesus who kicks the money changers out of the temple. Or maybe we think of God as an angry father who won't be satisfied with anything less than total self-sacrifice. We then carry around the burden of constantly trying to satisfy this demanding father, forgetting that God is willing to throw the biggest party for any lost soul that turns back to God, and apparently ignoring when Scripture describes God as a mother watching with great care over her children. Or maybe we only think of God as that great party thrower, decide that we must be blessed since so many people come to the classy parties we throw, and then assume God has left us now that we're supposed to socially distance, forgetting that Christ was a suffering servant who experienced radical rejection by his own people and even abandonment by God on the cross. You see, we can get so caught up in our imagination about what God must be like that we fail to allow God to reveal God's self to us. Ludwig Feuerbach, the great critic of Christianity, was onto something when he said in the 19th century that God was a human projection. Too often, our understandings of God are little more than psychological projections of our unmet needs, our competition with the Joneses, our fears of inadequacy, or our hopes of perfection. Feuerbach just didn't realize that the Desert Fathers and Mothers had already addressed this issue. And this is good news, not just because there's a God beyond Feuerbach, but because those little psychological idols are hard taskmasters from whom God has come to set us free. like the Hebrews were set free from their slavery in Egypt and led through the wilderness on their way to the promised land. After all, blessed are the pure of heart, for they shall see God, not as we imagine God to be, but face to face, in ceaseless, imageless, wordless, formless, pure prayer. Obviously, this journey takes a lifetime, and a presentation like this doesn't do much except sort of lay out the map that the Desert Fathers and Mothers have written for us. But I do hope it gives you a little bit of courage to take a step toward freedom by crossing into the wilderness of your own psyche, and to see the COVID pandemic as an opportunity to do so. Maybe this is like one of the plagues in Egypt, behind which we can hear God's voice saying, "Let my people go. Let them go into the wilderness to worship me. Let them wander long enough in the wilderness to shake off their attachment to those chains they should have left in Egypt. And let them make their way to the promised land." Obviously, the pandemic presents real difficulties and hardships for people. But insofar as at least one of those difficulties is being alone with our thoughts, I do hope this has given you a way to begin to turn some of the loneliness of that psychological wilderness towards love and prayer. Thank you.